A year before the flood, Kaiser was a ghost at the edge of town. Scarred, starving, mistrusted. Children were told to stay inside when he appeared. Farmers whispered he was cursed. The town council voted to have him destroyed. But fate intervened in the form of Helen Carter, a 72-year-old widow who knew the weight of grief. She saw not a monster, but a mirror of her own loneliness in those tired amber eyes. She made a choice that night, against the advice of every neighbor. She gave him shelter. No one could have guessed what that choice would mean, because months later, when the floodwaters rose and Helen's granddaughter was swept into the current, it wasn't a neighbor, a councilman, or even the sheriff who saved her. It was the very dog they had all condemned. This is not just a story about survival. It is about judgment and redemption, about the kind of loyalty you cannot buy, train, or legislate. It is about a dog who should have died, but lived to become the town's greatest hero. The town of Riverdale had always prided itself on its quiet charm. Rows of clapboard houses leaned into the spring sunshine, porches heavy with rocking chairs and flower pots, and the creek that curled through the edge of town was usually little more than a ribbon of silver. But that spring, the rains had not stopped. For 3 days and nights, dark clouds emptied themselves over the valley until the creek, swollen with fury, lost its gentle voice and became a roaring, mud-stained beast. In the afternoon, it happened. Helen Carter was standing on her porch with a hand pressed to her aching hip, watching the restless water from a distance. At 62, with her white hair pulled tight into a bun and her face lined with loss, she often sought comfort in watching the world beyond her lonely house. But this day carried no comfort. The air itself seemed unsettled, damp, thick, and vibrating with the roar of the creek. It was then she heard it. A child's scream, high and slicing, tearing across the water. "Grandma! Help!" Helen's blood froze. She turned, heart pounding, and saw the impossible. Her 6-year-old granddaughter Lily, her golden curls plastered with rain, her small arms thrashing, being swept away in the torrent. The child must have wandered too close to the bank, curious about the flood's power, and the earth had given way beneath her. Now the water had her, pulling her downstream with merciless force. "Lily!" Helen's voice cracked, a sound ripped out of her chest. She stumbled forward, skirts tangling around her legs, but the ground was slick and treacherous. The current was too strong for anyone her age to enter. She could only stand at the bank, helpless, her fingers clawing at the empty air. Neighbors arrived at the commotion, faces pale, eyes wide. Robert Taylor from the hardware store, 2 boys from the gas station, mothers clutching children by the shoulders. They lined the edge of the meadow, frozen by the sight of the little girl disappearing and reappearing between the waves. "Somebody do something!" Helen screamed. But no one moved. Even the strongest men knew the creek's wrath. It had taken more than one life during floods past. To dive in was to gamble with death itself. The seconds stretched unbearably. Lily's cries grew weaker, her head bobbing under again and again, her tiny hand grasping at nothing. Helen felt her soul splitting apart. To lose her, her only granddaughter, her last living thread to the son she had buried years ago, was a cruelty she could not bear. And then, a new sound cut across the chaos, the crack of a chain snapping. Heads whipped toward the hillside behind the meadow. A blur of black and tan muscle exploded into view, paws pounding the soaked earth with ferocious speed. The massive German shepherd everyone in town knew and feared was loose. "Kaiser," someone whispered, the name dripping with dread. Gasps rippled through the crowd. For a year, the dog had been spoken of in hushed tones, branded as dangerous, unpredictable, a beast that should have been destroyed. Parents had kept their children indoors. Neighbors had petitioned the council. People said he was wild, rabid, a threat to all, but Kaiser was not looking at them. His amber eyes, sharp and unyielding, were locked on the little girl fighting for life in the river. His body lowered into a full sprint, rain spraying from his fur as he cut a line straight to the bank. Helen barely had time to understand what she was seeing. The animal she had fed and sheltered, the creature others called a menace, was charging toward the torrent without hesitation. "Kaiser, no!" someone shouted. But the shepherd didn't pause. With a powerful leap, he hurled himself into the flood. The water swallowed him whole. For a moment, Helen thought she had lost them both, her granddaughter, and the dog she had taken in against every warning. But then, breaking through the surface, Kaiser surged forward, muscles straining against the raging current. His head was low, ears pinned back, each stroke of his legs a battle against the torrent that tried to drag him under. The townsfolk erupted into shouts, some in horror, others in awe. Helen could do nothing but clutch the edge of her shawl to her mouth, praying through ragged breaths. Her heart pounded so violently she thought it might burst. Lily's head dipped again, swallowed by the brown water. Helen screamed until her throat tore. And then Kaiser reached her. The dog lunged, teeth catching the fabric of Lily's little jacket, hauling her head above the surface. Lily coughed, gasped, her small arms instinctively wrapping around his thick neck. With a growl born not of anger but of raw determination, Kaiser turned into the current, fighting to keep her afloat. On the bank, no one moved. It was as if the whole town had forgotten to breathe. The beast they had voted to destroy was now the only force between life and death for a child. Helen's tears blurred her vision. "Please, God, let them make it." Kaiser's body disappeared beneath a wave, then burst up again, Lily still clinging to him. His strokes grew slower, labored, but he pushed toward the shallows with stubborn ferocity. Each second seemed carved from eternity, every heartbeat a knife in Helen's chest. And then, mercifully, they drew closer. Two boys from the gas station waded waist-deep, stretching out their arms. Kaiser, chest heaving, thrust Lily forward toward them, forcing the child into human hands. Helen collapsed to her knees as her granddaughter was lifted from the water, coughing but alive. Relief crashed through her body so violently she sobbed aloud, but Kaiser did not climb out after her. The shepherd staggered in the current, blood trickling from a gash reopened across his shoulder. He tried to push forward, paws scraping mud, but his strength was spent. With one last effort, he dragged himself onto the bank, then crumpled in the reeds, sides heaving, eyes dim. Silence fell heavy over the meadow. The dog that had been cursed, feared, and condemned now lay unconscious at their feet, the unlikely savior of the very child he had been accused of endangering. Helen gathered Lily into her arms, sobbing into her wet curls, torn between overwhelming gratitude and a new, piercing terror. For at the edge of her vision, she saw Edward Hale, the retired police officer who had led the charge against Kaiser, standing rigid. His face was pale, his jaw tight, and his words, when they came, were low and bitter. "That beast should never have been here." The crowd murmured, divided between awe and suspicion, as Helen looked from the trembling child in her arms to the wounded dog lying motionless by the riverbank. And in that breathless moment, she knew the battle for Kaiser's life was only just beginning. The flood swallowed the sound. All Helen could hear was the deafening roar of the water and the ragged gasps ripping from her own lungs. She clutched Lily's empty rain jacket in her hands, the fabric heavy with river mud, her body shaking with terror. Somewhere out there, in that raging torrent, her granddaughter was still fighting to stay alive. And the only hope left was the very creature the town had once marked for death. Kaiser. The shepherd's powerful body carved against the current, his black and tan fur plastered flat, his eyes fixed on the small bundle of life he had seized from the water. Lily's pale face bobbed in and out of the churning brown waves, her little arms tangled around his neck. Each time she slipped lower, Helen's heart stopped, until Kaiser lifted her again, forcing her above the water, his jaws clenched tight on her jacket sleeve. The townsfolk lined the bank in a stunned semicircle, rain dripping from the brims of their caps, fear rooting them to the spot. No one dared step into the water. Not one of them had the strength to challenge the flood. Yet they couldn't look away. They watched, spellbound, as the dog they'd called a menace fought for a child's life with a desperation that could only be called love. "Kaiser!" Helen's cry split the air, a voice both pleading and commanding. As if he heard her through the thunder of the river, the dog shifted, angling Lily toward the shallows. His strokes were steady, but slower now, each movement carving raw effort from a body already battered by old wounds and the brutal force of the current. For one agonizing moment, Helen saw only emptiness where Lily's head had been. The water swallowed the girl whole. "No!" she screamed, lurching forward, falling to her knees at the water's edge. Her arthritic hip seared with pain, but she didn't feel it. All she saw was the void where her granddaughter had vanished. And then, a surge. Kaiser dove, bubbles exploding around him, and rose again with Lily clamped between his teeth, sputtering but alive. The crowd exhaled in one collective gasp, as though they too had been drowning. The shepherd pressed on. His legs churned like pistons, but the effort tore at his body. A dark bloom spread across the water near his shoulder, mixing with the mud. Blood, rich and heavy, pouring from a wound, long scarred, but now torn open again. The gash across his flank, barely healed from some old violence, had split wide under the strain. Helen saw it and felt her soul twist. "Hold on, boy. Please, just a little farther." Step by agonizing step, the distance closed. Two young men waded out waist-deep, bracing themselves against the current, arms outstretched. Kaiser grunted, hauling Lily upward, pushing her toward their reach. His body dipped once, twice, nearly pulled under. But with a final surge of will, he thrust the child into their hands. The men seized her, dragging her up to the bank. Lily collapsed against Robert Taylor's chest as he rushed forward, coughing water. Her lips blue, but breathing. "She's alive!" someone shouted. A cheer broke out, wild and disbelieving. Mothers wept openly. Even the stoic men who had stood frozen moments before now clapped each other's shoulders, their relief spilling out in ragged exclamations. But Helen didn't join them. Her eyes were fixed on Kaiser. The shepherd had no strength left to follow. His body sagged in the current, legs thrashing weakly. He had given everything to get Lily to shore, and now there was nothing left. With a low, guttural sound, he tried to climb the bank, paws clawing at the mud. Twice he slipped back, swallowed almost entirely by the current. "No, don't let him go," Helen screamed, but no one moved. Fear of the animal still gripped them, even now, even after he had saved the girl. With a final heave, Kaiser's paws caught purchase. He dragged himself up far enough that his chest hit the reeds. Then he collapsed, sprawling across the mud, his sides heaving, blood pouring freely from the reopened wound. The crowd fell silent. Their cheers died to whispers. The dog lay motionless, his head resting in the muck, his eyes half-lidded. Steam rose from his body into the cold air. Each labored breath rattled, shallow, uncertain. "That dog," someone whispered. "He just saved her. He nearly died for her." Yet not all voices carried awe. From the edge of the group came a harsh, bitter tone. "Don't be fooled. A beast is still a beast." It was Edward Hale. He stood rigid, his hands clenched into fists, his jaw set in stone. His eyes, fixed on the crumpled shepherd, were unreadable. A mixture of recognition, anger, and something darker Helen could not name. But Helen didn't look at him. She sank to the ground, clutching Lily against her chest, rocking her granddaughter and pressing trembling kisses into her wet hair. Tears streamed down her cheeks, mingling with the rain. Relief, gratitude, fear, all collided within her like lightning splitting the sky. Above them all, the rain eased, as though the storm itself had paused to watch. The meadow was a tableau of contradictions. A child breathing again, a grandmother's sob of thanks, a community hushed into uneasy silence, and at the center, a wounded dog, broken but unbowed. Kaiser had saved a life. And in doing so, he had shattered the story the town had written about him. But Helen knew this was only the beginning. The meadow that bordered the swollen creek had never held so many people at once. Word of the rescue spread like fire through dry grass, and within minutes, the banks were lined with townsfolk, some still in aprons from the diner, others with work gloves, a few clutching umbrellas that did little against the driving rain. They stood in clusters, whispering, pointing, their eyes flicking between the little girl coughing in her grandmother's arms and the dark shape crumpled in the reeds. Helen Carter rocked Lily close, her own body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The child's chest rose and fell in a fragile rhythm, each breath a miracle. Lily's soaked curls clung to Helen's cheek as the old woman whispered promises through her tears. "You're safe, sweetheart. You're safe now." But her eyes, red and swollen, never strayed far from Kaiser. The shepherd lay on his side, motionless, his once powerful chest rising in shallow, ragged pulls. Blood trickled from his shoulder and soaked into the mud, diluted by the rain into thin crimson rivulets that snaked toward the river. Every instinct in Helen screamed to run to him, to press her hands against the wound, to beg him to hold on. Yet Lily whimpered, clinging tighter, and Helen couldn't bring herself to loosen her arms around her granddaughter. Around them, voices rose and fell like wind over grass. "Did you see it? He dragged her out himself. Never thought I'd live to witness a thing like that. They said he was dangerous, but he saved her life." Some spoke in awe, their eyes shining with newfound wonder. Others shook their heads, unwilling to surrender fear so easily. Don't let one act fool you. A wild dog doesn't change his nature. He's bleeding. Maybe it's best we let him go. Helen flinched at the callous words. How could they look at the animal who had risked everything and see only a threat? She tightened her hold on Lily, as though shielding the child not just from the river's cruelty, but from the judgment curling through the crowd. Then, through the murmur of voices, came the scrape of boots on wet gravel. A figure pushed forward from the gathering. Tall, broad-shouldered, despite the weight of years, his hat pulled low against the rain. Edward Hale. The retired police sergeant had lived 3 houses down from Helen for decades. Once respected, even admired, He had become a fixture of suspicion and bitterness in recent years, and ever since the dog had appeared in town, Edward had been its loudest, most unrelenting opponent. Now he stopped at the edge of the reeds, his gaze locked on the fallen shepherd. For a long moment, he said nothing. The only sound was the creek's roar and Kaiser's shallow, rasping breaths. Finally, in a voice low but sharp enough to cut through the silence, he muttered, "That beast should never have been here." The words fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of unease across the gathered crowd. Some nodded, seizing on Edward's authority, his history and uniform. Others shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Helen, at the small child clinging to her. Helen raised her head slowly, meeting Edward's stare with eyes that burned with grief and fury. She saw something flicker in his face. Not just fear, not just anger. Something deeper. Recognition, maybe. But before she could speak, Robert Taylor, the hardware owner, broke in. "Edward, with all respect, you saw what that dog just did. If not for him, we'd be dragging a body out right now." Edward's jaw tightened. One good deed doesn't erase what he is. You put faith in an animal like that, and sooner or later you'll regret it. The crowd broke into two currents, one murmuring in support of Robert's words, the other echoing Edward's warnings. The air itself seemed split, heavy with division. Helen's heart pounded. She wanted to shout, to silence them all, to tell them the truth she had seen in Kaiser's eyes that stormy night under her shed. The exhaustion, the fear, the quiet plea for mercy. But Lily whimpered again, and Helen swallowed her anger, focusing on keeping the child calm. "Grandma," Lily whispered weakly, her voice raw from swallowed water. "He saved me." The words, so small and fragile, carried farther than anyone expected. A hush fell, and dozens of faces turned toward the girl in Helen's arms. For one brief moment, Helen thought perhaps that innocence would pierce through the walls of fear. But Edward only shook his head, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. His eyes never left the dog. "He saved her today," he said, voice like stone. "But tomorrow it might be different." Helen's breath caught, fury pressing hot in her chest. She wanted to answer, to fight, but before she could form the words, a harsh cough rattled from the reeds. Kaiser's body jerked once, then sagged, his head sliding against the mud. His eyes fluttered shut. "No." Helen's cry broke into the damp air. She clutched Lily tighter, torn in two, joy at her granddaughter's breath against her neck, and fear that the dog who had given that breath might be slipping away forever. The townsfolk stepped back instinctively, as if death itself had brushed them. Some crossed themselves, others whispered prayers, but not one of them moved closer. The rain fell harder, drumming against the meadow, and thunder rolled across the hills. Above the roar of the storm, Helen's sobs carried. A grandmother's relief, a widow's grief, and a silent vow that this would not be the end. The chapter closed on the image burned into every witness's mind. A child alive by miracle, a dog unconscious at her feet, and a community split wide open between fear and gratitude. And in that fracture, the battle for Kaiser's life had only just begun. Helen Carter's farmhouse stood at the edge of Riverdale like a weary sentinel. 2 stories of peeling white paint and sagging shutters, its once proud garden choked by weeds and thyme. The wooden fence leaned tiredly toward the road, missing slats where winter winds had finally claimed victory. To anyone passing by, the house looked less like a home and more like a monument to grief. Inside, silence was its most permanent resident. Every morning, Helen rose before dawn, though she no longer had reason to. Her husband George had once depended on her early breakfasts before heading to the mill, and later her son Michael had done the same before taking over repairs on the farm. But now the kitchen table sat bare. The only sound the groan of old pipes as she filled her kettle. She made tea out of habit, not desire, sipping it slowly, while staring out the window at the field beyond. A field that should have echoed with laughter, the clatter of tools, the ordinary mess of life. Instead, it echoed with nothing. The accident had come 5 years earlier, sudden and merciless. A drunk driver on Route 7, headlights weaving across the asphalt, colliding head-on with George's pickup. Michael had been with him that night, heading back from a late delivery. In one cruel heartbeat, both were gone. Helen had buried her husband and her son on the same day, her hands trembling as the earth swallowed the last of her family. Since then, time had not healed. It had only dulled, like a blade left out to rust, its edge still sharp enough to cut whenever she brushed against memory. The townsfolk of Riverdale had tried in their way. Casseroles stacked on her porch, visits with careful smiles, invitations to church suppers. For a while, Helen forced herself to accept, to nod politely and murmur thanks. But grief is heavy, and hers grew too heavy to carry in public. Slowly, she withdrew. Invitations stopped. Conversation shifted when she entered a room. Neighbors still greeted her, but in whispers they called her the Widow Carter, as if the title explained everything. By the 3rd year, she rarely left her property. Groceries delivered to her porch, bills paid by mail, the rest of life quietly shrinking. Even her garden, once her pride, grew wild and unkempt. Roses tangled with thorns, ivy crawled across the porch, and dandelions claimed the once pristine lawn. Her routines narrowed to rituals: tea at dawn, knitting half-finished scarves that never left her basket, rocking in her chair until dusk painted the walls in amber. She spoke little, and when she did, it was often to the framed photographs on her mantel. George's steady smile, Michael's mischievous dimples. She whispered to them, as though they might answer, her voice cracking in the stillness. Loneliness had a way of carving deep lines into her face, but it also sharpened her perception. She noticed details others missed: the way the wind shifted before rain, the sound of a neighbor's door closing 2 streets away, the faintest echo of a child's laugh carried on the breeze. Each small reminder of life beyond her walls only deepened the ache in her chest. Riverdale itself moved on. New families moved in, babies were born, businesses opened and closed. Yet Helen remained frozen, her house an anchor dragging behind the town's steady current. She knew the whispers. She's not the same since the accident. Poor thing, she's lost everything. They weren't wrong. She had lost everything, and so she lived in her shell, weathering the seasons. Winter storms rattled her windows. Spring rains swelled the creek behind her house. Summer heat baked the dust into her shutters. Autumn leaves piled against her porch, untouched. The world spun, indifferent to her grief. Yet some nights, when the moonlight spilled across her empty bed, Helen felt an ache so fierce it drove her to the window. She would stare into the darkness, hands pressed to the glass, half expecting, half begging, for some sign that she wasn't entirely alone. The creak of a floorboard, a familiar laugh, even a whisper carried on the wind. But the only response was silence, endless and suffocating. The townsfolk saw a fragile woman who had outlived her usefulness. What they didn't see was the quiet strength that still pulsed within her, the stubborn ember that refused to extinguish. Helen carried her grief like armor. She had survived the worst loss imaginable, and though it hollowed her, it also forged something unyielding. Still, in the quiet hours before dawn, she often wondered, for what purpose had she been left behind? Why her, when George's laugh had been the heart of the community, when Michael's hands had been steady and kind? Why had fate spared her, only to bury her in silence? The answer never came. She sat alone, watching the rain streak her window, her hands curled around a chipped mug. In the distance, the creek roared louder than usual, swollen from days of downpour. Its voice reached her farmhouse, filling the emptiness with a reminder that nature's fury still moved freely, even when her own life had stalled. Helen sighed, rising stiffly to close the curtains. Her knees ached, her hip complained, but she endured. She always endured. Outside, unseen in the shadow of her shed, a pair of amber eyes blinked through the storm. The dog the town called a menace lay curled in the mud, ribs sharp against his matted coat, watching the faint glow of her kitchen window. Neither of them knew it yet, but two broken lives were about to collide, and in their meeting, something long buried would stir again. The storm rolled in with the kind of fury that seemed to shake the very bones of Riverdale. Rain pounded the farmhouse roof like fists against a coffin, and the wind screamed through the trees, rattling the shutters Helen Carter had meant to repair, but never found the will. Lightning split the sky, throwing the world outside into stark flashes of white and shadow. Helen sat in her kitchen, wrapped in her flannel robe, hands curled around her mug of chamomile tea. It was her nightly ritual, steady, unchanging, a fragile comfort against the chaos beyond her walls. She stared at the flickering light bulb overhead, listening to the storm's rage, when a new sound reached her ears. A crash. It came from the garden shed behind the house, metal against wood, sharp enough to slice through the roar of rain. Helen froze, her breath caught in her throat. Another crash followed, then the clatter of a trash can lid rolling across the yard. Her heart lurched. Memories of break-ins from years past, warnings about looters during storms, and whispers of wild animals in the valley collided in her mind. For a moment, fear told her to call the sheriff. But loneliness and a stubborn flicker of defiance pushed her to her feet. She grabbed her late husband's old baseball bat from behind the door, the wood worn smooth by decades of use, and stepped into the storm. The rain struck her face like cold needles, soaking her robe in seconds. She tightened her grip on the bat, squinting as the beam of her flashlight cut through the darkness. The shed loomed at the edge of the yard, its door swinging open, banging against the frame with each gust of wind. Her light fell across the ground. Overturned trash cans, scattered scraps of food, muddy paw prints smeared in chaotic circles. She followed them with growing dread, the beam trembling in her hand. Then, under the overhang of the shed, the light caught on something alive. Eyes. Two amber eyes glowed back at her, unblinking, set in a gaunt face, streaked with rain and mud. The creature shifted, and the shape resolved into the outline of a dog. A massive German shepherd, crouched low against the ground, ribs jutting sharply beneath a coat, tangled with blood and filth. His chest rose in shallow, ragged breaths, every movement laced with exhaustion. Helen's grip on the bat tightened. This was the dog the town whispered about. The stray no one dared approach. The one Edward Hale had warned would snap sooner or later. She had heard the stories. livestock found mauled, children frightened by its shadow, neighbors muttering about rabies and danger. Standing here now, with the storm screaming around her, she felt the weight of all those rumors pressing in. The dog growled low, a sound more weary than menacing. He tried to retreat further under the shed, but there was nowhere left to go. His body trembled, as though even that small movement cost more than he had to give. Helen's pulse thundered in her ears. She could swing the bat, end the threat before it began. That's what they would expect of her. That's what Edward would demand. But then her light fell fully across his face, and she saw it. Not rage, not madness, exhaustion. The dog's eyes, though sharp and wary, carried something else. A quiet despair that mirrored her own. A creature abandoned, battered by the world, too tired to keep fighting, but too stubborn to let go. Helen's chest tightened. It was the same look she had seen in her own mirror after George and Michael were taken from her. Her grip on the bat loosened. The wood slipped lower until it touched the mud. She took a step forward, her robe heavy with rain, and whispered through the storm, "You poor thing." The shepherd's growl softened, though his body remained tense. His ears flicked uncertainly, his breath hitching with pain. "I'm not going to hurt you," Helen said, her voice steady now, though her heart raced. She lowered herself slowly, her knees protesting, until she was crouched in the mud, the beam of her flashlight resting at her side. The rain plastered her hair to her forehead, but she barely noticed. Her eyes were locked on his, refusing to look away. "You're safe now." The words were quiet, but they seemed to ripple through the space between them. The shepherd blinked once, a slow, deliberate movement. His body sagged slightly, as though the fight had drained out of him at last. Helen sat there for a long moment, soaked to the bone, bat forgotten in the mud beside her. She didn't reach for him, not yet. She only stayed, her presence a fragile promise against the storm's cruelty. The wind howled around them, rattling the shed, tearing branches from trees. But beneath its chaos, something small and steady formed in the mud. The first fragile thread of trust between a broken woman and a broken dog. When Helen finally rose, her joints stiff and aching, she left the bat behind. She turned back toward the house, her robe dripping, her heart pounding with something she hadn't felt in years. Not fear, hope. The storm raged deep into the night, but inside Helen Carter's farmhouse, the world shrank to the soft glow of her kitchen lamp and the quiet, steady rhythm of her breathing. She moved slowly, her old bones stiff with the damp, yet her hands were purposeful. A pot of leftover beef stew simmered on the stove, filling the room with the scent of onions and broth. She ladled it into a chipped porcelain bowl, the same kind George had once favored, and carried it to the back door. Outside, the rain still fell in sheets. Helen's slippers soaked through as she crossed the porch and stepped into the yard. Her flashlight beam cut through the storm until it caught the shape of the shepherd, still crouched beneath the shed's overhang. His head lifted as she approached, ears pricked, eyes sharp with suspicion. Helen knelt carefully, setting the bowl down just within reach of the shelter. Steam curled upward into the cold night. The dog's nostrils flared, but he didn't move. His body trembled with hunger, yet pride and fear rooted him in place. Helen backed away a few feet, lowering herself onto an overturned bucket. She folded her hands in her lap, ignoring the rain soaking through her robe. Her voice, low and steady, carried just enough to reach him. "It's stew, warm. You need it more than I do." For long minutes, nothing happened. The storm roared around them, thunder shaking the ground, lightning cutting the sky. Helen sat still, her gaze never leaving his. Finally, hunger overpowered fear. The shepherd crept forward, each step cautious, muscles taut with the readiness to flee. His ribs jutted sharply beneath his matted fur, every movement revealing the toll of weeks, maybe months, of hardship. He reached the bowl and began to eat, devouring the stew in desperate gulps. Helen exhaled, relief washing over her. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath. When the bowl was empty, the dog retreated again, though this time he didn't vanish completely into shadow. His eyes remained on her, wary, but no longer hostile. Helen studied him in silence. She saw the scars etched across his body, the gash along his shoulder, the ragged patches of fur. But most of all, she saw his eyes, bright, intelligent, and unbearably tired. They reflected something she recognized all too well, a soul beaten down by loss, yet still clinging to survival. "I see myself in you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Alone, broken, and still here, even when the world wished we weren't." The words caught in her throat. She wiped at her eyes with the corner of her sleeve, embarrassed by the tears, even though no one was there to witness them. No one except the dog who watched her as if he understood. When the storm eased near midnight, Helen rose stiffly and made her way back to the house, but she didn't sleep. Instead, she prepared the old mudroom off the kitchen, long unused since George's boots had last been lined there. She dragged in blankets from the linen closet, spreading them into a makeshift bed, and placed an old towel beside it. She filled another bowl with water and set it near the door. The next night she tried again. Another bowl of stew, placed closer to the porch. The shepherd came faster this time, though he still retreated once the food was gone. The night after that, she placed it just inside the doorway. He hesitated long, his paws scratching against the threshold as though the step itself were a leap too far. "Come on, boy," she murmured. "It's warm in here. Safe." Finally, he limped across the line, his head low, his eyes darting to every corner of the room. When Helen gently closed the door behind him, he collapsed onto the blankets without resistance, too exhausted to care anymore. Helen stood over him, her heart twisting. "You're safe now," she said again, more firmly this time, as if speaking the words could will them true. By morning, word had spread. Robert Taylor from the hardware store stopped by under the guise of checking her roof after the storm. Sheila Peterson from the council walked past unusually slow, her eyes lingering on the back porch. Neighbors whispered, their voices laced with disapproval. The widow Carter's taken in that stray, that menace. Helen heard them. She saw the looks. Yet for the first time in years, she didn't retreat. Every time she stepped into the mudroom and saw the shepherd's amber eyes tracking her with cautious interest, every time he allowed her to place food within reach without growling, she felt something stir inside her, a fragile seed of loyalty taking root. She knew the town would not understand. They would call her reckless, accuse her of endangering others. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps she was reckless. But as she sat on the cold floor of her mudroom that night, watching the battered dog finally sleep in peace, Helen Carter understood something she had forgotten in the long years of her loneliness. Sometimes, compassion was the only rebellion worth making. By the time the spring rains gave way to softer days, the storm that had driven Kaiser under Helen Carter's shed was a memory. But in Riverdale, storms had a way of lingering even after the skies cleared. This one brewed not in the clouds, but in the whispers that drifted from porch to porch, pew to pew, across the small town. It began with small murmurs at the diner. "The widow Carter's taken in that stray," one voice said, low and cautious. "The big shepherd with the scar on his shoulder." A clink of coffee cups followed, the kind of silence that carried more weight than words. By afternoon, it was a certainty. Helen was harboring a menace. The rumors grew teeth as they traveled. Some said the dog had attacked livestock at the Jensen farm, though no one had seen it happen. Others swore their children had been chased near the schoolyard, though no scratches or bites were ever shown. Fear had no need for proof. It only needed repetition. And Riverdale, like most towns its size, thrived on repetition. By the week's end, children were kept indoors. The sound of a screen door slamming echoed through the neighborhood each time Kaiser's shadow passed along the fence line. Mothers tightened their grips on their little ones' hands, whispering, "Don't go near that house." Even the mailman, usually chatty, dropped letters into Helen's box with a glance over his shoulder and hurried back to his truck. Helen felt the shift. She noticed how conversations hushed when she entered the grocery store, how neighbors who once offered polite waves now turned away, their faces stiff. She told herself she was used to whispers. For years they had called her the widow Carter, a woman hollowed out by tragedy. But this was different. Now the whispers carried accusation, not pity. Inside her home, Kaiser grew stronger. His coat regained a dull shine, his ribs less visible as weeks of warm meals filled him out. He followed Helen from room to room, his amber eyes never straying far from her figure. In the evenings, he lay across the mudroom threshold, the quiet weight of his presence anchoring her in ways she hadn't realized she needed. He had not once bared his teeth at her, not once growled except when startled by sudden noise. Yet outside those walls, a story was being written that painted him as something feral, something waiting to snap. No one fanned that fire more than Edward Hale. The retired police sergeant made it his mission to spread warning. At the barber shop, his gravelly voice carried above the buzz of clippers. "One day, that dog will snap," he said flatly, eyes hard as steel. "Mark my words, he's got the look of a killer. You can't trust an animal that's tasted blood." At church, he cornered Sheila Peterson after Sunday service, pointing toward Helen's pew, where the old woman sat alone. "She's too soft. Can't see danger even when it's gnawing at her front door. Someone has to do something before a child gets hurt." At the hardware store, he leaned against the counter, telling Robert Taylor that ordinances existed for a reason. "We've got laws about dangerous animals. If she won't turn him in, the council should force her hand." The words spread, burrowing into the minds of townsfolk like seeds in fertile soil, and though many hadn't seen Kaiser at all, fear filled in the blanks. A large dog, unknown history, sharp teeth, a widow too stubborn to listen. It was enough to make people keep their children close, to pull curtains tighter at night. Helen knew. She saw the stairs from the sidewalk, felt the weight of judgment pressing against her windows. She heard the whispers carried by the wind. But when she looked at Kaiser, when she watched him lower his head gently into her lap, when she heard the quiet sigh he gave before sleep, she could not reconcile their fear with the truth she lived. Still, the tension thickened. It wrapped around her house like the ivy choking her garden fence. And in the quiet hours of the night, when the town was still, Helen sometimes wondered if the storm outside her walls had only been a prelude to the one gathering inside the hearts of her neighbors. Because storms, she knew, did not always begin with thunder. Sometimes they began with whispers, and in Riverdale, the whisper had already become a warning. The knock came just after noon, sharp and insistent against the old wooden door. Helen Carter set down the dish towel she'd been folding, her stomach tightening before she even opened it. Visitors had grown rare since she'd taken Kaiser in. When they did come, they rarely brought kindness. Through the lace curtain, she saw them. Robert Taylor, owner of the hardware store, his tall frame stiff with determination, and beside him, Sheila Peterson, a thin woman in her late 50s who carried herself as though the weight of the town rested on her narrow shoulders. Sheila was the kind of neighbor who remembered every ordinance and quoted it like scripture. Helen braced herself and opened the door. The March wind slipped inside, carrying the smell of damp earth. "Afternoon, Helen," Robert said, his voice too formal, the tone of a man who'd rehearsed his words. He tipped his cap out of habit, but there was no warmth in his eyes. Sheila didn't bother with greetings. She clutched a clipboard against her chest like a shield. "We need to talk," she said briskly. Helen stepped aside. "You might as well come in. No sense airing this on the porch." They entered the kitchen, their boots squeaking on the linoleum. Kaiser, who had been dozing in the mudroom, lifted his head. His amber eyes narrowed, ears pricking forward. A low rumble sounded deep in his chest. "Easy, boy," Helen murmured, laying a hand on the doorframe between them. The shepherd settled, though his gaze never left the visitors. Robert cleared his throat, shifting uneasily under the dog's stare. "Helen, we've all heard. About the stray. The town's worried." Sheila jumped in before he could soften the words. "Worried? They're frightened. That dog has been roaming for months, scaring children, attacking livestock." "That's hearsay," Helen cut in, her voice sharper than she intended. Sheila's lips pressed into a thin line. "It's enough that people feel unsafe. We have ordinances, Helen. Ordinance 15B states any animal deemed a threat can and should be surrendered to animal control, for the good of the community." Helen straightened her spine, the years of grief settling like armor on her shoulders. "He was starving, not dangerous," she said firmly. "I found him half dead under my shed." "You'd have left him there to die in the rain?" Robert's gaze flickered, but Sheila didn't waver. "You don't know his history. He could be diseased. He could turn on you at any moment." Helen's eyes softened as she looked toward the mudroom. Kaiser's head rested on his paws now, but his body remained coiled, ready to defend. "I know enough," she said quietly. "I've seen his scars. I've seen the fear in his eyes. That's not a monster, Sheila. That's a soul who's been hurt too many times." Robert shifted again, unease plain in his posture. "Helen, people trust you. You've always been a pillar in this town, but keeping him? It makes them question your judgment. We just don't want to see you get hurt." Helen met his gaze steadily. "I've already been hurt, Robert. You know that. Losing George, losing Michael. I know what real danger feels like. And I'm telling you, that dog is not it." The room filled with silence, heavy and unyielding. Rain tapped against the window, the only sound. Finally, Sheila exhaled sharply. "If you won't do the right thing, the council will have to intervene. We can't risk the safety of the town because of misplaced compassion." Helen's hand tightened on the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. She felt the weight of every eye in Riverdale pressing against her walls, judging, doubting. But when she spoke, her voice was calm, steady as the roots of an old oak. "You call it misplaced. I call it mercy. He stays." Robert looked down at the floor, his jaw working. Sheila's nostrils flared, her clipboard clutched tighter. Neither argued further. They turned for the door, the tension trailing after them like smoke. At the threshold, Robert paused. His voice was softer now, but edged with worry. "Just be careful, Helen, for your sake." The door closed behind them, leaving the kitchen quiet once more. Helen leaned against the counter, her body trembling from the confrontation. For years she had hidden from the world, too broken to fight. Yet standing her ground for the shepherd had ignited something she hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. From the mudroom came a soft shuffle. Kaiser rose to his feet and padded closer, his gaze fixed on her face. Helen reached out, her hand resting on his scarred head. "They don't see you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But I do." The shepherd leaned into her touch, silent, steady. And in that small act, Helen knew the choice she had made wasn't just about saving him. It was about saving herself. The afternoon sun filtered weakly through thick spring clouds, washing the Carter property in pale light. Helen was kneeling in her backyard, her gloved hands deep in the soil of a neglected flower bed. She hadn't gardened in earnest since George's passing, but the simple act of turning earth gave her a fragile sense of order. Beside her, Kaiser padded silently, his massive frame moving with an ease that belied his scars. He sniffed the air, ears twitching, tail low but alert. For weeks now, Helen had noticed how he shadowed her every step outdoors. Whether she hung laundry on the line or filled the bird feeder, Kaiser stood close, his body angled as if he expected trouble to come from beyond the fence. She had begun to accept it, the quiet, steady presence that made her feel less alone in a world that had grown too sharp with loss. That's when the crunch of gravel carried across the yard. Helen straightened slowly, brushing dirt from her gloves, and looked toward the far fence. Edward Hale stood there, broad-shouldered even in old age, his face lined deeper by bitterness than by time. His eyes locked on Kaiser immediately, narrowing with a kind of heat Helen hadn't seen in years. "Afternoon, Helen," Edward called, though his tone carried no warmth. Kaiser froze. In an instant, his posture changed. He moved from Helen's side to stand directly in front of her, shoulders squared, chest broad, amber eyes fixed on the intruder. A low growl rumbled from deep within him. Not frantic, not wild, but steady, controlled, purposeful. It was the sound of a soldier, warning an enemy to keep their distance. Edward's boots scraped closer against the gravel, stopping just short of the fence. "That's exactly what I'm talking about," he said, pointing a weathered hand at Kaiser. "Look at him. One wrong move, and he'll be at my throat." Helen took a step forward, resting her hand on the shepherd's head. His growl softened, but didn't cease, his body still tense and ready. "He's protecting me," she said evenly. "That's not the same as aggression." Edward snorted, the sound bitter. "You don't understand animals like I do, Helen. That dog's a powder keg. One day he'll go off, and no one will be able to stop him." Helen felt her patience fray. She straightened her spine, meeting Edward's stare across the fence. "What I understand," she said slowly, "is that when I found him, he was half dead, starving, bleeding, terrified. Not once has he lifted a tooth at me. Not once." The lines in Edward's face deepened as his jaw clenched. "You've let grief blind you. You think saving some stray will fill the hole your son left. But this—" He jabbed a finger toward Kaiser, who growled louder in response. "This is a mistake that will cost you, and maybe the rest of us too." Helen flinched as if struck. Mentioning Michael was a cruel twist, one Edward knew would cut her deepest. She steadied herself with a breath, fingers tightening in the shepherd's fur. Kaiser pressed against her leg, a living wall of loyalty between her and the man who stood accusing her. "Edward," she said quietly, her voice low but firm, "what is this really about? Why does he make you so angry?" For a moment, something flickered in Edward's expression, a shadow quickly buried. He looked at Kaiser with an intensity that was more than fear. It was recognition. But just as quickly, his face hardened again, the mask sliding back into place. "You want to know?" His voice was sharp. "Because I've seen it before. Dogs like him, bred for work, bred for danger. They don't belong in backyards or kitchens. They belong behind fences, under lock and key. You're gambling with everyone's safety." Helen studied him, the suspicion in her chest growing heavier. His hostility wasn't just about ordinances or safety. There was something personal in the way he spat the words, something buried in the years before the dog appeared in Riverdale. Kaiser's growl deepened as Edward leaned closer to the fence, his teeth flashing for the first time. The sound silenced Edward mid-sentence, forcing him to step back despite himself. The retired officer's hand twitched toward his belt, as though reaching for a weapon long since absent. His pride cracked just for an instant, beneath the shepherd's unyielding stare. Edward recovered quickly, straightening to his full height. "You think you can keep him here, Helen? You won't. I'll bring this to the council. They'll make sure that animal is removed. Permanently." With that, he turned sharply and strode back down the gravel path, his shoulders rigid, his fists clenched at his sides. Helen watched him go, her heart hammering. The tension lingered even after he vanished beyond the hedges, the storm of his words echoing in her ears. Kaiser finally relaxed, though his body remained pressed against hers, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Helen stroked his head, whispering into the quiet yard. "They don't understand. But I do. I see what they don't." The shepherd leaned into her touch, silent but steadfast. Yet Helen couldn't shake the unease gnawing at her. Edward's hostility ran deeper than neighborhood concern. It was personal, intimate in a way that frightened her. She didn't know what history tied him to the dog at her side, but she knew this. The truth was buried somewhere in Edward Hale's anger, and sooner or later it would surface. For now, all she could do was stand her ground, and trust that Kaiser would stand with her. The first morning after Kaiser stepped into Helen Carter's mudroom, the house felt different. Not louder. He made little sound beyond the rhythm of his breathing, but fuller, as though the hollow rooms had found a heartbeat again. Helen moved carefully around him, her slippers brushing the worn linoleum, hands carrying a basin of warm water and clean clothes. She had barely slept, lying awake with the storm still rattling her windows and the weight of a choice pressing on her chest. Taking him in had been instinct, but instinct now demanded courage. Kaiser stirred as she knelt, amber eyes opening. His ears twitched back, muscles taut, but he didn't rise. The gash along his shoulder glistened in the dim light, angry and swollen. "Easy, boy," Helen whispered, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I'm not here to hurt you." The cloth brushed his wound, and a low growl rumbled from his chest. He bared his teeth slightly, eyes locked on hers. Helen froze, cloth hovering. "All right," she said softly. "I'll go slow." She shifted, brushing his paw instead, tracing the mud-caked fur along his ribs. He stiffened, then exhaled sharply, conceding. When she returned to the wound, his growl faded to silence. "You've been through hell," she murmured as she worked, rinsing and pressing. "I know how that feels." The cloth turned red, the water pink, but she kept on, patient and deliberate. At one point, Kaiser shuddered, his body jerking as though memory itself had cut deeper than her touch. Helen paused, resting her hand on his flank. "I know," she whispered. When she finished, She wrapped the shoulder with strips torn from an old sheet. He watched her throughout, ears flicking, eyes wary, but not hostile. By the time she tied the last knot, the distance between them had shifted. That night, she left him in the mudroom with stew and water, but sometime before dawn, she woke to a sound, a shuffle, a sigh. Moonlight revealed a shadow across her doorway. Kaiser. He hadn't climbed into the bed or paced the room. He had simply lain across the threshold, his head on his paws, guarding her. Helen's throat tightened. For years the nights had been hardest, silence pressing too heavy. But now, knowing another soul kept watch, she drifted into the first unbroken sleep she'd known in years. At sunrise, her foot brushed his fur as she swung her legs from bed. Kaiser lifted his head, but didn't move until she rose. Helen chuckled, startled by the sound of her own laughter. "So that's how it's going to be, Guarding me now?" The shepherd blinked slowly before lowering his head again. For the first time in years, Helen felt something stir that wasn't grief. It was trust. By the week's end, his wound was healing, and she had grown used to the rhythm of his presence. That morning, after breakfast, she slipped on her garden shoes. Kaiser padded behind her into the yard, moving with a quiet discipline that surprised her every day. As she pinned laundry to the line, she saw him sniffing near the gate. Almost without thinking, she called, "Sit." To her astonishment, he obeyed instantly. Haunches down, posture erect, eyes locked on hers. Helen blinked. "Stay." He froze, muscles taut but steady. She stepped backward. He didn't move. "Come." Kaiser trotted to her, precise, stopping neatly at her side. Her heart pounded. "Heel." He aligned with her left leg, walking in perfect rhythm as she paced the yard. Not luck. Discipline. Training. She whispered in awe, "You're trained." She tested further, tossed a stick. "Fetch." He darted forward, scooped it up, and dropped it at her feet, tail wagging faintly, but body composed. One last word slipped from her lips. "Search." Kaiser transformed. Head low, ears pricked. He quartered the yard in wide arcs, nose sweeping with methodical precision. This wasn't a game. This was work. Serious, ingrained, professional. At the far fence he paused, barked once, then bounded back to her, eyes burning with intent. Helen pressed her hands to her mouth. "You weren't a stray at all. You had a job." Kaiser leaned into her hand, warm and solid. For the first time, she felt not only the weight of his body, but of his history pressing between them. Sunday came. Riverdale's little white church had always been more than worship. It was where gossip mingled with hymns. Helen hadn't attended much since the accident. Sitting alone in a pew once filled with George and Michael had been too painful, but now, with whispers about her spreading faster than spring thaw, she forced herself to go. Heads turned when she entered in her best coat, silver hair pinned back. Conversations hushed, then resumed, quieter, words slipping into currents, just out of reach. Helen lifted her chin and took her seat near the back. Two women in front whispered behind gloved hands, "She's keeping it in the house. A beast that size." With her granddaughter visiting sometimes, madness. Helen's jaw tightened. She'd endured whispers before, but another voice cut through, deeper, sharper. Edward Hale. The former sheriff leaned toward Robert Taylor, his broad frame filling the pew. His voice, though hushed, carried a weight that silenced Helen's breath. "I'm telling you," Edward said, "that animal is cursed. He's cost lives before." The words struck like ice. Cursed, cost lives. Robert shifted uneasily. "You can't just say that, Edward. Folks are uneasy enough." Edward's reply was low but fierce. "I know what I'm talking about. Some scars aren't just skin deep. Some dogs carry shadows that never leave." Helen's fists clenched in her lap. She strained to hear more, but the organs swelled, drowning his words. All she carried away were fragments. Cursed. Cost lives. Throughout the service, her eyes flicked toward Edward. His profile was stern, hands clenching as if holding secrets too heavy to spill. When the last hymn ended, Helen lingered at the steps outside. Edward's voice rose again, speaking to Sheila Peterson. "You mark my words. If she keeps that animal, it won't end well. It never does." Sheila glanced at Helen with pursed lips before walking off. Helen passed Edward on the steps. Their eyes met briefly. His gaze wasn't just distrust. It was fear, buried beneath anger. She wanted to demand answers. Instead, she walked past, her cane tapping against the stone. Back at the farmhouse, Kaiser was waiting at the back door, as if he had sensed her coming. His amber eyes softened, and he pressed his head into her palm. Helen stroked his fur, whispering, "What did you live through, boy? What shadows make Edward so afraid?" The shepherd leaned into her hand with a weight that was both grounding and haunting. Helen stared at the horizon, Edward's words echoing in her chest. For years, she had believed her story was written in sorrow. But now, with Kaiser at her side, she knew differently. Riverdale carried secrets. Secrets bound to this dog, to Edward, to a past she had yet to uncover. And one way or another, she would find the truth. The Riverdale Community Hall hadn't been this full in years. Folding chairs, usually stacked in storage, lined the floor in neat rows, every seat filled. The air buzzed with unease, thick with whispers, and the shifting of restless bodies. At the front, beneath the faded flag and the mayor's portrait, Sheila Peterson adjusted her glasses and tapped the microphone. The screech silenced conversations. "As council chair," Sheila began, her voice sharp with authority, "I have called this emergency session to address the safety of Riverdale, a matter that concerns every man, woman, and child in this town." Helen Carter, sitting alone in the front row, felt dozens of eyes pressing into her back. "For over a month," Sheila continued, lifting a clipboard, "Mrs. Carter has been harboring a dangerous animal, a German shepherd known to have roamed our town, threatening children, chasing livestock, intimidating neighbors. Despite warnings, she has refused to surrender him." A murmur rolled through the hall. "Dangerous, menace, Widow Carter." Sheila raised the petition. 47 residents, nearly every household, demand immediate action under Ordinance 15B, which allows removal of any animal deemed a public threat. Applause and calls rose from the back. "Get rid of it before someone gets hurt." Helen rose slowly. Though grief had bent her shoulders, her voice carried clear. "I've lived here my whole life. Many of you stood with me at George's funeral. You were there when I buried Michael. And now, when I've found one reason to keep going, you want to take it away?" Her gaze swept the room, searching for a friendly face. None met her eyes. "That dog was starving when I found him, half dead from wounds no one else cared to treat. He is not dangerous. He is broken, like many of us, and he deserves the chance to heal." "Broken animals bite," someone muttered. Helen pressed on. He has never harmed me. He obeys commands with precision. I don't understand, but respect. This is no wild beast. This is a dog who once had a purpose, and can again. From the second row, Edward Hale's voice cut through. Purpose or not, that dog is a danger. I've seen his kind. Once they've drawn blood, they never stop. Ripples of agreement stirred. Helen lifted her chin. What you call menace, she said softly, I've seen for what it is. Pain. If you can't see that, maybe grief has blinded you. Her words fell heavy into silence. Then whispers rose again, sharper than before. Sheila tapped the mic. Thank you, Mrs. Carter, but sentiment cannot outweigh safety. Ordinance 15B exists for a reason. 47 signatures demand action. Helen stood rigid, aching but unbent. Then another voice rang out. Pamela Jenkins, the elementary school principal. She strode into the aisle, heels clicking. Mrs. Carter, you may see gentleness, but I see risk. Every day children pass your house. What happens when one runs to pet him? What happens when instinct overrides good intentions? Murmurs of agreement rippled. Parents frowned, arms crossed. It's not just about your safety, Pamela said firmly. It's about every family here. Are we willing to gamble with our children's lives because of misplaced compassion? Before Helen could answer, another voice rose from the far side of the hall. Frank Wilson, 80 if a day, leaning on his cane. I'll tell you what I saw, Frank said. Last Tuesday, Helen walked that dog past my place. My cats sprawled on the steps. That shepherd walked right by. Didn't so much as flick an ear. I've seen mean dogs. That's not one. The hall stirred. Pamela's jaw tightened. You all remember when my barn burned, Frank went on. Half the town came to help me rebuild. We knew what community meant. And community doesn't mean turning our backs on a creature just because it makes us uneasy. Helen's eyes glistened. For the first time that night, she wasn't entirely alone. But Pamela pressed back. With respect, Frank, you don't oversee 200 children. This isn't about barns, it's about responsibility. And responsibility, Frank shot back, isn't just rules on paper. It's stepping up when someone, human or animal, is in need. Helen did that. That's my responsibility too. Voices clashed across the hall. She's right. What about the children? Pamela's overreacting. If it were dangerous, Helen would know. She's blinded by loneliness. She's braver than the lot of us. Sheila slammed the gavel. Order! The noise subsided, but the division hung heavy. Helen gripped her chair, wanting to speak, but the room was drunk on fear. Then Mayor Thompson rose from the front row, raising his hands. A man who disliked conflict, he looked weary but resolute. Friends, he said, I understand your concerns. I hear your fears, but I also hear Mrs. Carter. We are a town that values safety and compassion. We must hold both. The crowd shifted uneasily. My proposal is a compromise. The dog remains with Mrs. Carter under strict conditions. A secure fence, a muzzle in public, liability insurance, and a professional behavioral assessment. This protects the town and gives the animal a chance. Murmurs rippled. Not outright hostility, some relief. Helen's breath caught. It wasn't perfect, but it was hope. Then a chair scraped back sharply. Edward Hale stood. No. The single word froze the room. No compromise, Edward said, voice like gravel. That dog does not belong here. Not behind a fence, not on a leash. Gone. A ripple of unease spread. The mayor tried to respond. Edward, surely. I see clearly, Edward snapped, slamming his hand on a chair. You want to put a muzzle on a loaded gun and call it safe, but it's still a gun. One day it will go off, and when it does, no policy in the world will bring back what we lose. Helen's heart pounded. His voice wasn't just fear, it was hatred. Edward, she asked, trembling but firm, why do you despise him so? For a moment, something raw flickered across his face. Recognition, almost guilt. Then it hardened. Because I know his kind, he said flatly. And I know what they're capable of. Gasps rustled the room. Even those who feared Kaiser shifted at Edward's fury. His obsession was laid bare. The mayor cleared his throat. The council will deliberate, but let the record show a compromise was offered. Edward sat, eyes locked on Helen. The message was clear. This wasn't over. Helen sank back into her chair, chest aching. Around her, voices buzzed, some relieved, others emboldened by Edward's hard line. But one truth settled in her heart. Riverdale's battle over Kaiser was no longer about safety. It was about stories. Some chose menace. She chose mercy. And she knew Edward Hale would not let it rest. The knock came just after dawn, when mist still clung to the fields and robins were only beginning their chorus. Helen Carter froze. Few visitors came at this hour, and those who did seldom brought good news. Through the lace curtain she saw the white county truck in her driveway, the seal of animal control faint on the door. Her heart sank. The man on the porch was tall, broad-shouldered, but softened by age. He removed his cap politely. Mrs. Carter, James Cooper, County Animal Control. His voice was low, steady. I expect you know why I'm here. Helen's throat tightened. The council sent you. He glanced at the clipboard in his hand. Orders to seize the German Shepherd in your care. Ordinance 15B, Public Threat Classification. The words landed like stones. Helen gripped the doorknob. He's not a threat. He's healing. Before James could reply, a low growl rumbled from inside. Kaiser appeared in the hallway, amber eyes locked on the stranger. He didn't lunge, just stood, steady as stone. James's hand twitched toward the tranquilizer holstered at his hip, then stilled. That's some presence. Helen stepped between them. Please, watch. She took a breath. Sit. Kaiser obeyed instantly. Stay. His body froze, muscles taut but controlled. Helen stepped backward. Come. Kaiser rose, trotting to her side, aligning neatly with her leg. James's brow lifted. His hand dropped from the holster. Well, I'll be damned. Helen's voice trembled, but her conviction held. Does that look like a menace to you? James studied the shepherd, then exhaled. That looks like training. Serious training. He looked back at his clipboard. But paper doesn't care about training. I've got 47 names here demanding his removal. And if I don't bring him in, the sheriff will. Helen's eyes filled. Please, if you take him now, they'll kill him. He's the first soul to make this house feel alive again. For a long moment, James said nothing. Then he sighed, rubbing his temple. Officially, I should load him up. Unofficially, his voice dropped. Unofficially, I didn't see enough compliance this morning to justify immediate seizure. Helen blinked. You mean? You've got 24 hours, he said. Tomorrow I'll have no choice. Use the time. Find someone who can vouch for him. A trainer, a vet. Proof. He started down the steps, then paused to glance back. Most strays would have gone for my throat the second they smelled this uniform. He didn't. That tells me everything. Don't waste this chance, Mrs. Carter. The truck door slammed. The engine faded. Helen closed the door with shaking hands, then knelt to press her forehead to Kaiser's scarred head. We've got one day, boy. One day to prove them wrong. Helen's mind raced. Proof. Not her word. Something undeniable. Her eyes landed on Michael's old digital camera, scratched but still working. She gripped it tightly. All right, boy. Let's show them. In the backyard, the morning sun glinted through the trees. Helen steadied the camera, her voice clear. Sit. Kaiser dropped instantly. Stay. He froze, every muscle controlled. She stepped back. Come. He trotted to her side, posture perfect. Helen's throat tightened. Even the basics spoke volumes. But she pressed on. Search. The transformation was immediate. Kaiser lowered his head, quartering the yard in sweeping arcs, nose close to the ground, moving with military precision. When he reached the far fence, he barked once, sharp and certain, before racing back. Helen caught her breath. This wasn't obedience. This was training. She hid a handkerchief beneath a crate in the shed, returned to the yard, and whispered, Find. Kaiser's nose twitched. He crossed the grass swiftly, straight to the shed. A paw, a bark, then a sharp look back at her. Helen's hand shook as she lifted the handkerchief. You found it. Her voice cracked as she faced the lens. This was hidden. He knew. Finally, she tried the one command she both dreaded and longed to test. Guard. Kaiser moved forward, placing himself between her and the gate. His body stiffened, eyes scanning the horizon, a living wall. No snarl, no bark. Just vigilance, absolute and steady. Tears blurred Helen's eyes. Not a stray, she whispered. Not a menace. A working dog. She shut off the camera and dropped to her knees. Kaiser softened instantly, pressing his head against her chest. She wrapped her arms around him. You're not what they think you are. You never were. Back inside, she replayed the footage. Grainy, but undeniable. Obedience, precision, skill. Proof. Tomorrow, when James Cooper returned, she would show him. The house was dark, but for the faint glow of Helen's old computer. The clock ticked toward 2 a.m., yet sleep would not come. James's warning echoed. Find proof. Don't waste this chance. Her fingers moved clumsily over the keyboard. She typed, Search and rescue dog commands. Articles filled the screen. Training manuals, disaster footage, demonstration videos. Each detail mirrored what she had seen. Quartering patterns, scent tracking, protective stances. Her chest tightened. He wasn't just trained, he was specialized. Still, she needed more than behavior. She needed history. She typed again, missing search and rescue dogs, floods, Westfield County. Buried in the archives, she found it. Tragedy strikes. During Westfield, flood response, search dog presumed lost. Her breath caught. The article described catastrophic floods 2 years earlier. Among the casualties, a German shepherd named Ranger, swept away during a rescue attempt. Presumed drowned. Helen whispered the name aloud. Ranger. Across the room, Kaiser's ears twitched. His eyes sharpened, as if the word stirred something deep inside. Her hand shook as she scrolled further. Ranger, the article said, had belonged to the Mountain Valley Search and Rescue Unit. His handler, Sergeant Edward Hale. Helen sat frozen. Edward, the same man who had stood in the hall demanding Kaiser's destruction. The man who had muttered about curses and blood. Kaiser, Ranger, had been his dog. Why had Edward told no one? Why bury the truth and call the dog dangerous? She dialed numbers, county offices, search and rescue contacts, her voice urgent. I believe I've found a lost shepherd. Trained. Obedient. Most calls ended in silence or polite refusal. Finally, Sarah Donnelly, a coordinator from the Westfield floods, spoke. Yes, I remember Ranger. Remarkable animal. We lost him in the current. Edward was devastated. Resigned soon after. We assumed. She hesitated. If you truly believe you have him, check for a microchip. Any vet can confirm it. Helen closed her eyes. If Ranger is alive, then Edward has been lying. Sarah's voice softened. If he's alive, Mrs. Carter, you're holding a miracle. Helen hung up, turning to where Kaiser lay watching her. His amber eyes were steady, as though he had understood every word. She knelt beside him, pressing her hands into his fur. You're not cursed, she whispered fiercely. You're a hero, and he betrayed you. Kaiser leaned into her touch, grounding her. By dawn, Helen sat surrounded by printouts and the camera with its proof. She had enough pieces to see the truth clearly, even if Riverdale would resist. Kaiser wasn't just a stray in her care. He was Ranger, Edward Hale's partner, a working dog presumed drowned, a ghost returned. And now she understood. Edward's fight wasn't just about fear. It was about guilt, and that guilt might be the only thing that could save Ranger's life. The morning sun was already warming the dew on Helen Carter's lawn when a silver sedan pulled into the gravel driveway. Helen froze on the porch. She knew that car. She knew the figure who stepped out, smoothing her jacket as if bracing for battle. Rachel. From the back seat, a small face peeked out, curly hair, wide eyes, lips parted in nervous curiosity. Lily. Helen's chest ached. Visits were rare and strained. The years after Michael's death, building walls neither woman could cross. Rachel still blamed Helen for the accident that had taken her husband. Helen still resented the distance Rachel had put between them. And yet, here they were. Helen stepped off the porch, her slippers crunching on gravel. Rachel, she said softly. Lily. Hello, Helen, Rachel replied, her tone polite but taut. She turned. Come on, sweetheart. Lily slid from the car, clutching a backpack. She didn't run to her grandmother, but didn't shy away either. Helen saw Michael's smile on her face and nearly buckled. My goodness, Helen whispered, kneeling despite her aching knees. You've grown so much. The girl gave a small nod, shy but steady. Rachel cleared her throat. I didn't come unannounced for no reason. I've accepted a position at Westfield Medical. Long hours, unpredictable shifts, and I don't have childcare. Helen straightened, her heart hammering. You're asking? Rachel hesitated, glancing at the peeling paint of the farmhouse. Doubt flickered, but she pressed on. I'm asking if Lily can stay here, just for a few weeks. Hope surged through Helen, tangled with disbelief. More time with Lily, something she'd prayed for. But behind the front door, Kaiser waited in the mudroom, alert to every sound. Rachel, before you decide, there's something you need to know. Rachel stiffened. What? I've taken in a dog, a German shepherd. His name is Kaiser. Rachel's expression hardened. A dog? Here, Around Lily? Helen raised her hand quickly. Please. He was starving when I found him. He's gentle. With me. German shepherds are powerful animals, Helen. If the town doesn't trust him, why should I? Helen swallowed. She couldn't explain the truth yet. About his training, about Edward Hale. She only said, I won't let anything happen to Lily. You know that. Rachel studied her for a long moment, then exhaled. All right, but precautions. He stays away from her until I'm convinced he's safe. Promise me. I promise. At that moment, Lily tugged her mother's sleeve. Mommy, can I see him? The dog? Not yet, Helen said gently, kneeling to meet her granddaughter's eyes. Soon. He just needs time. Lily frowned thoughtfully. I saw him through the window. His eyes looked like when people cry, but don't make tears. Helen's throat closed. Out of the mouths of children came truths adults could not bear. She smoothed Lily's curls. Yes, darling. He's lost things, just like us. Rachel shifted, unsettled. I'll bring her clothes and books this weekend. Thank you, Helen whispered. For the first time in years, Rachel's voice softened. Just take care of her. That's all I ask. Helen nodded, steady. With everything I have. As the car pulled away, Helen held Lily's hand. The farmhouse no longer felt empty, but behind the door, Kaiser waited, and Helen knew the hardest part had only begun. That afternoon, Helen prepared sandwiches in the kitchen, while Lily pressed against the living room window, knees tucked beneath her. Outside, Kaiser stood beneath the maple tree, scanning the fence line with quiet vigilance. He doesn't move much, Lily murmured, but his eyes look like he misses someone. Helen stilled, knife in hand. The words pierced her. She joined the girl at the window. Yes, sweetheart. He has lost. Just as we have. Later, when Rachel returned with clothes and schoolwork, she found Lily still sketching by the window. The page held a careful drawing of a dog with solemn eyes too large for the paper. Lily, Rachel said, setting the bag down. You've been watching him again? The girl nodded. He doesn't scare me. He just looks like he wants a friend. Rachel's lips tightened. She looked out at Kaiser's silhouette in the fading light. He's not like the dogs at the park, honey. But Grandma knows him, Lily said simply. Helen met her granddaughter's gaze. Yes, I know him, and he knows me. That evening, after Lily went upstairs, Rachel lingered at the kitchen table with Helen. Only the lamp lit the room. I need to be clear, Rachel said. I'm trusting you with Lily because I have no other choice. But you're keeping a dog. This town wants gone. Helen folded her hands. He isn't dangerous. He's disciplined. Loyal, protective. Rachel frowned. One wrong moment is all it takes. Helen leaned forward. Do you remember when Michael was little? How he always brought home strays? He swore he saw something in their eyes. No one else could. Kaiser is the same. He's not a menace. He's sorrowful. And loyalty. Rachel's resolve faltered. You really believe that? With all my heart. Rachel rubbed her temples, weary. All right, but strict precautions. He doesn't get near her unsupervised. One scratch, Helen, and she comes home. That's fair, Helen said softly. 2 mornings later, after rain washed the fields clean, Helen made her decision. She found Lily coloring on the rug. Sweetheart, she said, would you like to meet him properly? The crayon paused mid-stroke. Kaiser? Helen nodded. But you must do exactly as I say. Sit still. Let him come to you. Yes, Grandma, Lily whispered. Helen settled the girl on the sofa, hands folded in her lap. Then she opened the mudroom door. Kaiser rose slowly, amber eyes alert, as though he had been waiting. Come, boy, she murmured, clipping the leash. As they entered, Kaiser froze. His gaze locked on the small figure on the sofa. Lily sat perfectly still, feet dangling, eyes wide. Kaiser tilted his head, ears pricked. A soft whine slipped from him. Not warning, but something uncertain. Easy, Helen whispered. This is Lily. She means no harm. The shepherd stepped forward, cautious, deliberate. Each movement carried weight, as if instinct told him this mattered. At last he reached the sofa. He lowered his head, sniffing Lily's folded hands. He's warm, Lily whispered. Let him choose, Helen murmured. Kaiser lingered, then sighed deeply and rested his head in the child's lap. Lily's fingers hesitated, then stroked his fur gently. The shepherd melted. His body softened. His ears eased. His tail gave a slow wag. His sharp eyes closed halfway in something close to peace. He likes me, Lily whispered. And tears burned Helen's eyes. Yes, darling, he does. Minutes stretched in silence. Child and dog joined in quiet communion. For the first time since he'd limped into her mudroom, Kaiser seemed to rest. When Rachel arrived that evening, she froze in the doorway. On the rug, Lily giggled softly as Kaiser lay beside her, his head pillowed on her leg. Rachel's lips parted to protest, but Lily looked up, radiant. Mommy, he's not scary. He's just tired. Like us. Rachel faltered. Helen's eyes begged for patience. Suspicion lingered, but Rachel said nothing. That night, when Lily was asleep, Helen found her sketchpad on the nightstand. On the page was Kaiser again, but this time his eyes were gentle. His head nestled into a child's lap. Helen closed the book, tears falling unchecked. For the first time in years, she believed healing was possible. Not just for her, not just for Lily, but for the broken dog who had found peace in a child's touch. By mid-morning, the sky had settled into a quiet gray, the kind Riverdale wore when it was thinking about rain. Helen Carter sat at the kitchen table, glasses low on her nose, a legal pad filled with names and dates. Beside it lay a neat stack of printouts, the article about a search dog presumed drowned, a county incident summary, a photograph of volunteers waist-deep in brown water. Kaiser dozed in the doorway, one ear flicking each time she turned a page, as though he was listening. Westfield, Helen murmured, circling the word. 2 springs ago. At the library, a young archivist read headlines over the phone. Levee breach, evacuations, search and rescue deployments. And there again, the name. Ranger. A pause, then, one caption lists Sargent E. Hale, retired. Helen pressed her pen harder against the page. Edward Hale. Another email from a volunteer described chaos, lost radios, rising water, a dog that had alerted at the old depot, but the team had been sent elsewhere. We did our best, it ended. Sometimes the water wins. Helen read it twice, her palms flat against the table. She called a retired dispatcher next. His voice carried the measured cadence of someone who had narrated disasters too many times. A stalled pickup, a levee collapsing, a mother calling 911 twice in an hour, and in the middle of it all, a K9 alert at the depot. The handler argued to check it. The protocol said otherwise. Who was the handler? Helen asked, though she already knew. Hale, he admitted. Said he'd circle back. The boy was found 2 days later, trapped on the second floor when the stairs gave way. Helen imagined it, the shepherd pulling toward the depot, the handler caught between instinct and orders, turning away. Her own chest ached with recognition. How many times had she ignored her bones because paper and polite voices told her to move on? When she hung up, the house was silent, but for Lily's laughter upstairs. Helen reached down and found Kaiser pressing against her leg. She stroked his neck, feeling the scar beneath his fur. "You told them," she whispered. And they didn't hear. The next morning carried a brittle cold. Helen pulled her shawl tight and walked down Elm Street. Edward Hale's house stood neat and rigid, its porch sagging, flagpole polished. She found him stacking wood, every motion clipped like a drill. "Morning, Edward," she said carefully. "Helen." He didn't look up. "I've been reading about Westfield." His shoulders froze. Slowly, he turned. "What business do you have poking into that mess?" "I wanted to understand where Kaiser came from. I found mention of a dog, Ranger, presumed drowned, and his handler." She held his gaze. "Sergeant Edward Hale." Silence cut sharper than a shout. He dropped the log with a crack. "You don't know what you're meddling in," he snapped, voice shaking with heat. Kaiser stiffened beside Helen, ears pricked, a low growl in his chest. She steadied him with a hand. "I'm not meddling. I'm searching for the truth." Edward's jaw clenched. Truth drowned that night with a boy who never should have been out there. People point fingers. They'll tear down anyone, even a man who gave his life to order. Then why tell the council Kaiser was dangerous before you even looked at him? For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Fear, recognition. Then it hardened. "That animal doesn't belong here," he muttered. Helen stepped closer, her voice steady. "You knew him, Edward. You trained him, and when he lived, you abandoned him." "Careful, Helen," he growled. "Some things are better left buried." She didn't flinch. "I'll decide what burdens I carry." The air stretched thin as wire. Then Edward hurled another log into the stack. "This conversation never happened. For your sake." Helen tugged lightly on Kaiser's leash. "Come, boy." As she walked back, she glanced over her shoulder. Edward stood rigid, staring at the ground as though it held every mistake he'd ever made. Beside her, Kaiser brushed her leg. She whispered, "He's afraid of you, or of what you remind him of." That evening, Helen tried to settle with tea, but Edward's voice echoed, "You don't know what you're meddling in." Upstairs, Lily's footsteps creaked. Soon, the girl appeared at the stairs, curls loose around her face. "Grandma," she whispered, "why does Mr. Hale hate Kaiser so much?" Helen's breath caught. "What makes you ask, darling?" "I heard from him today. He was angry, and he always looks at Kaiser like he wants him gone. But Kaiser saved me. Why would anyone hate him for that?" Helen guided her to the sofa. Lily curled close, her small fingers clutching Helen's hand. Kaiser padded over and lay at their feet, resting his head on Lily's toes. The child smiled faintly at the weight of him. "Sometimes," Helen said carefully, "people carry secrets so heavy, they blame others instead of themselves. Mr. Hale knew Kaiser once. Something happened, and he couldn't forgive himself. So he blames the dog. But that's not Kaiser's fault," Lily said, frowning. "He didn't do anything wrong." "No," Helen whispered. "He didn't." For a while they sat in the glow of the fire. Then Lily tilted her face up. "Will you make him tell the truth, Grandma?" Helen's throat tightened. Out of the mouths of children came the questions adults avoided. She kissed her granddaughter's curls. "I'll try, sweetheart. Shadows can't last forever. Light finds a way." Later, Helen watched her sleep. Kaiser stretched across the doorway like a sentinel. She thought of Edward's eyes, the crack in his voice, the ghosts he carried. He had tried to bury them under anger, but truth had a way of rising, like water. At the window, the creek murmured louder than usual, fed by rains upriver. Clouds gathered heavy on the horizon. Helen pressed her hand to the glass. "The truth must come out," she whispered. Behind her, Kaiser lifted his head, amber eyes bright in the lamplight. And though the house was still, Helen knew the storm, both the Rivers and Edward's, was coming. For 3 days, the air had grown heavy, clouds sagging without release. On the 4th morning, the sky broke. Rain sheeted down, hammering the farmhouse roof, drowning the fields until the world blurred into grey. Helen Carter stood at the window, watching the creek rage. It was no longer a gentle ribbon of spring, but a black, swollen river that clawed at its banks. She turned to Lily, crouching to meet her granddaughter's eyes. "Stay inside today. Promise me." "I promise," Lily said solemnly, clutching her red sweater. For a while the house held. Lily colored at the table. Kaiser sprawled at her feet, head heavy on her shoes. Helen busied herself with laundry, listening to rain drum the roof. But then, the silence. No crayon scratching. No chatter. "Lily?" she called. No answer. The chair stood empty, a crayon rolling off the table. Upstairs, beds and dolls untouched. Panic seized her chest. She stumbled to the back door, open, rain blowing in. And there, on the gate, a scrap of yellow. Lily's raincoat. "Kaiser!" she cried, but the chain on the post was snapped, deep gouges in the mud where he'd torn free. Helen clutched the little coat to her chest. Beyond the meadow, the creek roared. She shoved through the gate, slipping on the wet slope, calling her granddaughter's name into the storm. The creek had become a river, black with silt, carrying trees, fences, scraps of sheds. Somewhere in that chaos, her Lily. "Lily!" she screamed. A bark answered, sharp, urgent. Kaiser. Then she saw it, a streak of red clinging to a half-submerged log wedged against rocks. Lily. Her small hands scrabbled at peeling bark, lips blue, hair plastered to her face. "Kaiser!" Helen cried, just as the shepherd appeared on the near bank, pacing, gauging the current. He barked once, coiled his muscles, and leapt. The water slammed him sideways, dragged him under. Helen's breath stopped, but he burst up again, cutting diagonally across the torrent, every stroke precise, fighting toward the child. Blood streaked from his old scar, lost instantly in the flood. "Hold on, Lily!" Helen shouted, stumbling along the bank. Kaiser reached the log, scrabbled up and shoved his body against it to brace. Lily slipped, crying out. He pressed his nose to her wrist. "Here. Me." She clutched his ruff with both hands. He shifted, anchoring her with his weight. The log lurched free. Kaiser pushed off, spinning into the current with her clinging to him. He rose beneath her ribs, lifting her face to air, swimming burdened now but steady. "Come on, boy," Helen begged. At last he reached a back eddy near the far bank, staggering onto a scrap of mud no wider than a kitchen table. He collapsed beside Lily, chest heaving, blood streaming from his shoulder. He nudged her chin until she coughed water and drew a shuddering breath. Her fingers tangled weakly in his ear. Relief broke through Helen in a sob. "Stay with him, sweetheart. Don't move." But the island trembled. Water chewed at its edges, pulling chunks into the torrent. Kaiser sensed it. He rose, swaying, and planted himself broadside between Lily and the current, his body a living wall. Rain lashed his eyes, but he did not blink. "Hold," Helen whispered, prayer and command alike. A siren wailed faintly in the distance. Headlights ghosted through trees. A truck skidded into the meadow. Edward Hale leapt out, rain plastering his hair. "Where is she?" "There," Helen pointed, voice breaking. His eyes followed, and froze. Across the water stood the shepherd, battered but unyielding over the child. Edward staggered as if struck. His lips formed a name Helen barely heard. "Dear God." "Ranger." Kaiser's ears flicked. Despite exhaustion, recognition flared. A whine rose from his chest, half sorrow, half longing. Edward fell to his knees at the water's edge. "It's you," he whispered. "I told them you drowned, but you didn't. You survived, and I left you." Helen's heart lurched. "Why, Edward?" His voice cracked, raw. "There was a boy." Ranger, alerted at the depot, insisted. "I pulled him away. Protocol said elsewhere. The boy drowned. His parents asked why I hadn't trusted my own dog." His shoulders shook. "I couldn't face him after that. I couldn't face myself. I drove him out, left him miles away, told the world he was gone. It was cowardice. I abandoned him." Rain washed down his face, but the tears were his own. Helen's voice trembled with fury. "And you've spent years calling him dangerous, when the danger was your silence." Edward bowed his head. "If I erased him, I could erase the failure. But he's still here, saving the child I couldn't save." Sirens closed in. Emergency crews spilled from trucks, unfurling ropes and rafts. Edward surged to his feet, his old authority breaking through. "There's a child and a dog stranded," he bellowed. "Move!" The rescue line snapped taut across the torrent. A technician in harness crawled hand over hand, water thrashing at him. Helen clutched Lily's raincoat, every breath a plea. The rescuer reached the island, secured Lily first. Her small body swung across the rope, limp but breathing. Helen sobbed as medics caught her on shore, rushing her to the ambulance. But her eyes stayed on Kaiser. The rescuer bent again, looping a second sling around him. The shepherd sagged, blood dripping steadily, yet his gaze never left Lily. Edward pressed a trembling hand to his mouth. "Ranger," he whispered. Helen turned on him, rain streaking her face. "If he dies after saving her, the truth will bury you." "I know," Edward said hoarsely. On the bank, Helen clutched Lily's raincoat as rescuers hauled Kaiser's limp frame across the flood. Hero and outcast, savior and exile, all bound in one bleeding dog. The storm had taken much, but it had stripped lies away. The truth stood bare. Edward Hale's failure, Ranger's loyalty, the cost of silence too long kept. As the ambulance doors closed on Lily, Helen whispered into the rain, "Don't you dare leave us, boy. Not now. Not after all this." Hospitals had a way of swallowing time. Hours folded in on themselves, minutes stretched like wire. For Helen, the world narrowed to a waiting room washed in pale fluorescent light, the smell of antiseptic sharp in her nose. Lily lay in the pediatric ward, stable now, after oxygen and blankets and a doctor's calm assurances. "She's strong," the nurse had said gently. "Children bounce back." Helen had pressed her lips to her granddaughter's damp hair, whispering thanks to God, to fate, to the dog who had refused to let her go. But now, she sat in another part of the building, her eyes fixed on a swinging set of double doors. Behind them, Kaiser fought for his life in the emergency wing of the veterinary clinic partnered with the hospital. A rare arrangement. But tonight, necessity bent rules. Surgeons worked on him just as doctors had worked on Lily. It was a strange comfort. Man and beast bound together in struggle, their survival equally precious. Edward Hale sat opposite her, a paper cup of coffee cooling in his hand. He hadn't touched it. His shoulders sagged, his face hollow, every line carved deeper by guilt. He had shed his usual stiffness, no uniform of pride left to wear. For a long time, the only sound was the steady click of a clock and the muted chatter of nurses at a distant station. Then Edward spoke, his voice gravel broken by years of silence. "I should have told the truth long ago." Helen's eyes didn't leave the doors. "Yes, you should have." He shifted, the chair creaking. "I blamed him, Ranger, for my mistake." His breath hitched on the name, as though speaking it after so many years carried both relief and punishment. "We were sent out in the Westfield floods. A boy was missing. 15. His parents begged us to find him." Helen's hands tightened around Lily's raincoat, folded on her lap like a relic. Ranger alerted near an abandoned house. He was insistent, pawing, whining, that stance he had when he was sure. Edward shook his head. "But I thought he was confused. Though the current, the debris, had scrambled the sense, I pulled him away. I told him to move on." His eyes shimmered under the harsh light. "We left." Helen closed her eyes, seeing the scene in her mind. The boy waiting, Ranger knowing, Edward turning away. "They found him 2 days later," Edward whispered. "Upstairs, trapped. The water had risen too high. If I had trusted Ranger, if I had listened." His voice broke, and he pressed a trembling hand over his mouth. "That boy would have lived." Silence fell heavy. Rain lashed faintly against the windows, as if echoing the story's weight. Helen opened her eyes and studied him. "So, you made Ranger bear the burden." Edward's jaw clenched. "Every time I looked at him, I saw the boy. I couldn't forgive myself, so I couldn't forgive him. One night, I drove him out past the county line, left him by a rest stop. Told myself it was mercy, that someone else might find him. But the truth," his hands curled into fists, "the truth is, I abandoned my partner, the one soul who trusted me without question." Helen's breath caught. She thought of Kaiser, Ranger, bleeding on that island, holding back a river with his body to protect Lily. The same dog Edward had cast aside because he could not bear his own shame. "You tried to kill him again," she said softly, "not with your hands, but with your words. You convinced the town he was dangerous. You wanted them to do what you hadn't the courage to." Edward flinched as though she'd struck him. "Yes," he admitted. "Every council meeting, every whisper I fed. I thought if Ranger was gone, the past could be gone too. But he wouldn't disappear. He came back, found you, saved her." His gaze lifted toward her, eyes raw. "He saved your granddaughter because I didn't save that boy. He never stopped being who he was meant to be. Only I did." Helen let the silence stretch. She remembered Kaiser's wary eyes the first night under her shed, the slow trust he'd built, the loyalty he'd shown her in small, steadfast acts. He had carried all this history in his bones, and still he had chosen to protect, not to hate. "You don't deserve him," she said finally. Edward nodded, a tear breaking free despite the iron in his jaw. "I know." They both looked at the doors then, waiting, the weight of confession hanging between them. Nurses passed, their shoes squeaking softly on the linoleum. Somewhere down the hall, a child laughed faintly, a fragile sound against the storm. After a while, Helen spoke again, her voice steadier. "But maybe you can try to make it right. Not with words, with what you do next." Edward swallowed hard, eyes fixed on the floor. "If he lives, I'll spend whatever time I have left honoring him. Not just him, what he stands for. I'll train others. Build what should have been built years ago. A team. A place where no handler forgets to listen." Helen turned the raincoat over in her lap, her fingers brushing the small, frayed sleeve. She thought of Lily's laughter, of the way Kaiser had rested his head in her lap, of his body stretched across that island, like a bridge between death and survival. "Then pray he lives," she whispered. At that moment, the double doors swung open. A young veterinary surgeon stepped out, her face weary, mask dangling around her neck. Helen surged to her feet, heart hammering. "Well?" she demanded. The woman hesitated, then nodded. "He made it through surgery. The next 24 hours will be critical, but he's stable for now." Helen's knees nearly gave. Relief flooded her like warmth after frostbite. She clutched the raincoat tighter, her lips trembling with words she could not speak. Edward exhaled a ragged breath and bowed his head, whispering something too low for her to hear. A prayer, or an apology, meant for ears beyond human reach. For the first time that night, hope pierced the vigil, but with it came the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same. Truth had been spoken. Confessions had cut open old wounds, and Ranger, Kaiser, still lay between them all, the living proof of loyalty unbroken, even when men had failed. News in Riverdale traveled faster than any siren. By morning, the whole town knew. The dog once branded a menace had saved a child, nearly giving his life in the attempt. And whispers carried a second truth, one heavier still, that Edward Hale, the man who had campaigned hardest for the dog's destruction, had once been his handler. The story spread in the pews of churches, over counters in diners, at the hardware store Robert Taylor kept. By afternoon, it was on the front page of the county paper. Outcast, shepherd, saves child, exposes old wounds. For years, Helen Carter had felt the weight of her neighbor's stares, like stones in her pockets. Now, when she walked into town to buy groceries, those same eyes softened. Mothers clasped her hand and whispered, "Thank God for him. Thank God for you." Children craned their necks, asking when they might see the hero dog. For the first time in years, Helen's loneliness cracked, light spilling through. Yet under that warmth lay the raw edge of guilt. People remembered their own signatures on the petition calling for Kaiser's removal, their whispered rumors about attacks that had never happened. And they remembered Edward Hale's voice, heavy with authority, telling them that some animals were born dangerous. At the next town meeting, the hall was as packed as it had been on the night of condemnation. But this time, the air vibrated with something different, not fear, but urgency. Sheila Peterson tapped the microphone, her face unusually flushed. "We owe a debt," she began, "to Helen Carter, who refused to give up, and to the dog, who proved us all wrong." She glanced toward Helen in the front row, then toward Edward, seated stiffly beside her, his head bowed. But debts are not repaid with words. We have the chance to turn this shame into something that will last. Robert Taylor stood, his voice carrying across the hall. We all saw what he did. That shepherd held back death itself for a child. We can't change how we treated him, but we can make sure no one questions a trained rescue dog again. Riverdale needs its own search rescue unit. Not just relying on the county, not just volunteers. We build it here, in his name. Murmurs rippled through the room. Pamela Jenkins, the school principal who had once warned of danger, rose hesitantly. If that dog had not been there, Lily Carter would be gone. And her voice cracked. I was wrong. I let fear speak louder than sense. Our children deserve better. Our town deserves better. One by one, voices joined, farmers, teachers, parents, even those who had once crossed the street when Helen walked Kaiser through town. By the time Mayor Thompson stood, the decision was nearly made. Then it's settled, he said firmly. Riverdale will establish its first search rescue center. Tonight, we begin fundraising. Land, labor, money, whatever you can give. We'll build a place where training, loyalty, and courage are honored, not feared. Applause thundered through the hall. Helen sat still in her chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The sound washed over her, strange and almost unreal. For months, she had stood alone against the tide. Now the tide had turned, sweeping her along. Edward Hale rose slowly, the room quieting at once. His face was pale, his voice measured, but heavy. You all know who I am. You know what I did. A hush fell deeper. I betrayed my partner. I abandoned him. And then I tried to erase him, because I couldn't face my own failure. His hands shook as he gripped the lectern. Ranger, Kaiser, whatever name he carries, he deserves better. If you'll let me, I'll give every hour I have left to this center. I'll train others. I'll teach them never to make my mistake. There was no applause this time, just silence. Thick, considering. Then Frank Wilson, the elderly farmer who had once defended the dog, called out, "Redemption's a hard road, Edward, but it's a road worth walking." The crowd shifted, and then a few clapped. Hesitant at first, then stronger. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was permission. That night, the first pledges were written on slips of paper and dropped into a wooden box at the front of the hall. By week's end, a plot of land near the old mill had been donated. Volunteers arrived with shovels and lumber. The Riverdale Search Rescue Center was no longer an idea. It was a rising foundation, built from guilt and gratitude in equal measure. Helen visited Kaiser every day during his slow recovery. The veterinary staff called him a miracle. He bore his bandages with quiet patience, his eyes tracking Lily whenever she entered the room. The child would curl beside him on the mat, reading in a soft voice, her hand resting gently on his paw. One afternoon, Edward stood awkwardly at the doorway, watching. Kaiser lifted his head, ears twitching. For a moment, the air froze. The shepherd's gaze fixed on his former master, old memories stirring. Edward lowered himself to one knee, voice rough. "I failed you once," he said quietly. "I won't again. If you'll let me, I'll walk this road beside you." Kaiser blinked slowly, then laid his head back down on Lily's lap. It was not forgiveness, but it was not rejection either. A truce of silence, the beginning of something that might heal in time. Helen, watching from a chair in the corner, felt the smallest weight lift from her heart. This fragile thread, woven from pain, truth, and respect, was enough. For now. Weeks later, the town gathered at the center's groundbreaking. The mayor spoke. Robert read pledges, and children waved signs with Kaiser's name in bold letters. At the front, Helen stood with Lily's hand in hers, Edward on her other side. When the first shovel struck earth, Helen whispered to the child, "Remember this, sweetheart. Remember that a dog they once wanted to destroy became the reason this town found its heart again." Lily leaned close to Kaiser, who stood proudly by her side, fur glinting in the sun. She whispered into his ear the same words she had said the night he laid his head in her lap. "You're the best dog in the world." And this time, the whole town seemed to agree. By September, the fields wore their late summer gold, a soft burnish that made every blade of grass look dipped in sunlight. Wind moved across the meadow in long, patient breaths, laying the tall stems down and lifting them again as if testing their faithfulness. The half-built Riverdale Search Rescue Center stood at the edge of the property, framework up, roof sheathed, the scent of cut lumber still bright in the air. Beyond it, on the open training grounds, a German shepherd swept the field in careful arcs, nose low, tail level, a metronome of purpose. Kaiser was whole again. The scar at his shoulder ran pale beneath the fur, a seam mended by time and hands that had learned gentleness. He quartered the meadow with the old precision, the kind born not only of training but of calling, moving in tight, deliberate patterns, casting the wind, adjusting, reading what the world exhaled and left behind. "Mark your bounds," Edward called to the cluster of volunteers at the start line. His voice carried, steady, but changed. Less command, more invitation. "Watch his angles. You don't control the dog. You read him. Your job is to listen." The newest recruits followed, eyes narrowed against the light, clipboards tucked awkwardly under arms. They were farmers, a mail carrier, 2 high school seniors who had spent the summer stacking sandbags and had come away wanting to do more. They had believed 100 stories about Kaiser before the flood. Now they believed the truth. The dog traced another arc, came to a halt, lifted his head. The wind brought him something. He pivoted 2 degrees, barely more than a thought, and continued. Helen watched from the shade of a cottonwood, the kind of shade that comes easy in warm months and feels like grace. Lily sat tucked against her side, knees drawn up, a plastic whistle laced on a cord around her neck. She hadn't blown it once. She didn't need to. Kaiser worked, and the world quieted around him. "Do you see?" Helen murmured. Lily nodded, solemn as a church mouse, eyes wide. "He's listening to the air," she whispered back. "Like it's talking." "It is," Helen said. "He's always listened better than the rest of us." Across the field, Edward set a hand on the shoulder of a volunteer who'd stepped too far into the pattern. "Back 1 pace," he advised. "If you press, he'll widen. Let him tell you where the scent lies. Don't guess it for him." There had been weeks when Edward's presence near Kaiser drew a stiffening in the dog's shoulders, an old wariness that required time to ease. Those weeks were gone now, not erased but layered over, like rings in a tree trunk, each one telling its year of drought or abundance. Trust had returned in increments, a leash passed hand to hand, a field worked side by side, a shared stillness after training while Lily read aloud from the porch steps. There were apologies a human tongue could not carry, and there were reparations only a day's honest work could pay. Edward had learned the weight of both. "Hides in the rye," he called, pointing to the blind tucked under bundled straw. A volunteer crawled into place, laughter shaking the grass. Kaiser slowed to a stop, drew in a breath so deep it seemed to reach the center of him, and sat. His ears flicked once, twice. He barked, a single, joyous note, then drove toward the scent and froze again, nose hovering, tail sweeping a slow half-moon. "Alert," Edward said quietly, almost to himself. "That's your textbook right there." He lifted a hand to the trainees. Don't rush him. Reward at source. The reward, a soft-voiced woman with a pocket full of treats, met him at the blind. Good boy, she whispered into his fur. Good boy. He leaned into the praise, then glanced up as if to find two faces in particular. He found them. Lily's hand lifted in a wave so small it was almost thought. Helen's smile rippled the lines around her eyes into kindness. They ran one more scenario, then another. The rhythm of it worked its slow magic. Deploy, sweep, locate, reward. Every time the volunteers learned, Kaiser seemed to grow. No taller, no heavier, just more himself. He worked until the wind shifted, and then he worked that too, making small adjustments, the way a musician retunes between songs. Eventually Edward blew his whistle, the signal clean and light. Kaiser trotted in, tongue lolling, a grin only dogs can make, the one that looks like relief with edges of pride. He slowed as he reached the cottonwood, and Lily slid off the bench to meet him. She didn't fling her arms around his neck. She didn't need to. She pressed her forehead to his, and let her breath find his breath, and that said everything. He's the best dog in the world, she whispered, mouth against his ear, as if telling a secret that had somehow become the town's most public truth. Kaiser closed his eyes, content. Edward stopped a few paces back, respectful of the moment, hat in his hand. The wind tugged at his shirt. The sun laid a warm hand on his shoulders. He looked to Helen. She looked back. No more and no less than a truce lived there, burnished by work and the kind of decency that is not loud. He didn't try to fill the space with words. He'd learned that silence, kept rightly, can be a promise. Let's break for water, he told the volunteers, voice warm. Debrief in 10. Then we'll run a grid through the cottonwoods. They drifted toward the coolers, talking quietly, pointing, already beginning to see the field the way Kaiser did, as a book opened to the page the wind had marked. A few children straggled along the fence, watching with a reverence usually reserved for parades. On the unfinished building, a temporary banner snapped in the breeze. Riverdale Search Rescue, founded in honor of Kaiser, Ranger. The old name and the new stood beside each other, not in competition, but as two halves of the same river that had finally found its bed. Helen ran a hand through Lily's curls. Time to let him drink, she said gently. Heroes need water too. Lily giggled and stepped back. Kaiser padded to the steel bowl set under the spigot, lapped without hurry, then returned to her side. It was a small thing, that circle and return, but Helen felt it as a vow renewed. This place, these people, this work. From the training field came the beginnings of another exercise. Flags tucked into earth, a map unfolded on a truck hood, Edward's finger drawing a path across the grid. He glanced up once more. You ready, partner? He called softly. Kaiser's ear tipped. He didn't leave Lily's side. Not yet. He waited for her to lift her palm and make the smallest circle, a sign they'd given him, a promise. I'm here. You can go, and I will still be here when you come back. At her gesture, he turned, reclaimed the field, and the work began again. Afternoon thinned into a finer gold. Shadows lengthened like calm. The shape of Riverdale had changed. A fracture healed over with something stronger than bone. People came and went, leaving their names on a board labeled Sign Up, and their dollars in a jar with a hand-lettered note. For the ones who search, and for the ones who wait. A farmer dropped off hay bales for obstacles. A teacher offered a Saturday of math to help with maps. Someone with a camera asked to take a picture, and then didn't, because some days are better held in memory's softer light. Helen breathed it in, the quiet bustle, the ribbon of creek, tamed today, telling its endless story beyond the trees. The dog working, then resting, then working again. There were still signatures on old petitions tucked into drawers around town. There were still nights when rain brought nightmares. But here, under the open sky, those things were not rulers anymore. They were rings in the tree, a history acknowledged, not a sentence. She thought of the first night under the shed. Ribs like a washboard, eyes dim with hunger and something worse, abandonment. She thought of the fence line confrontations, the council's gavel, the river's dark mouth. She thought of a child's hand on a dog's scar, and the way that touch had rewritten the house's silence. Sometimes heroes arrive loud, trumpeted and bright. More often, she decided, they come ragged and mistrusted, carrying a quiet that looks like danger until the day it's called to save. Sometimes, heroism is as simple as holding the line between fear and mercy, between the past and the life that waits beyond it. Edward returned to stand beside them. They watched in companionable hush as Kaiser swept the last quadrant and sat, sure and still, eyes on the point the wind had named. A volunteer jogged to the blind, laughter rising when Kaiser's tail thumped approval. "You were right," Edward said at last, voice low, worn gentle by effort. He was never the danger. Helen didn't answer. She didn't need to. The field answered for her. The dog did too. Kaiser trotted back, accepted a palm against his chest, then sank to the grass with a sigh that sounded like contentment laid down. Lily leaned into him. The sun slipped another inch toward evening. New boards would go up tomorrow. More hands would come. There would be winters to outlast, springs to respect, calls in the night no one wanted to receive. But for this hour, the world seemed to hold steady in its turning. "He's the best dog in the world," Lily whispered again, as if sealing it. And in the tender hush that followed, Riverdale, once a chorus of doubt, seemed to agree. Loyalty, after all, shines brightest when it is least believed in. And sometimes the ones we cast aside are the ones who, without bitterness and without fanfare, carry us home. Sometimes the stories that stay with us the longest aren't the ones about grand victories, but about quiet moments of loyalty. A dog waiting by a door, a gentle head resting in our lap, a bond that doesn't need words. German shepherds, with their strength and devotion, remind us how deep love between people and animals can run. They carry us through storms, both real and unseen, and often give us more than we could ever repay. If you've ever wondered how to deepen that connection with your own dog, there are gentle resources out there that can guide you. Not as rules, but as little doors into better understanding. One that I've found meaningful is a simple guide for building trust and communication with your companion. It's nothing flashy, just thoughtful ways to listen a little closer, notice a little more. I'll leave it to you, whether you want to explore it. Think of it as something a friend might quietly pass along after coffee, because in the end, the greatest gift we can give our dogs is the same one they give us every day: our time, our presence, and our love.